So I took my first course with Chuck in 1972. That, a bit alarmingly, was 40 years ago. And I was told at lunch yesterday that nobody participating in this conference could match that number. So I think it's fair to say that I have the biggest debt to Chuck of anyone here, at least in terms of longevity. I'll begin with a brief account of my views about secularism, then offer a quick discussion of Taylor's not dissimilar account. Tariq's view is also not dissimilar, and then try to trace what's the same and what's different in these two accounts. There are differences between us, but they're pitched more at the level of rhetoric than of substance. Still, rhetoric matters. It strikes me that the ideas that really matter in the area of religion and politics are rather simple and prosaic ones, namely why we in the West live in a fundamentally secular society and why we should be deeply fearful about living in a society or other people living in societies that are anything other than fundamentally secular. Above all, we need reminders about easy to take for granted facts about contemporary life. We wouldn't want to bar Mitt Romney from seeking the US presidency on account of his religious beliefs, but neither would we want those religious beliefs to have any special authority should he become president. Why? First of all, because political association is a community of citizens, not a community of believers. To borrow a formulation of Will Kimlicka's, which for me articulates a foundational principle, he writes that boundaries of state and nation rarely, if ever, coincide perfectly, and so viewing the state as a possession of a particular national group can only alienate minority groups. The state must be seen as belonging equally to all people who are governed by it, regardless of their nationality. Well, the principle is just the same and just as valid if we substitute religion and religious for nation and national. And the principle obviously has no less force in cases where a minority religion, rather than the majority religion, holds the seat of power. For the Church of Latter-day Saints to have any special authority vis-a-vis other denominations or other religions would mean the state would be owned by Mormons or owned by them to a greater extent than it is owned by other citizens. This would be, to put it fairly mildly, normatively problematical. In the contemporary United States, there's no shortage of theocratic political actors who believe, as the Reverend Jerry Falwell memorably put it in his Independence Day sermon of 1976, that the idea that religion and politics don't mix was invented by the devil to keep Christians from running their own country. The number one desideratum in thinking about secularism is to be able to explain to these people why theirs is not a legitimate kind of politics. One of the reviewers of my civil religion book wrote that he couldn't understand why I opposed secularism to theocracy rather than opposing secularism to religion. The answer is simple. Theocracy is the politicization of religion. There's no necessary contradiction between religion and secularism, but there is a necessary contradiction between theocracy and secularism. Theocracy is neither an abstract theoretical possibility nor the memory of a long-banished past. It's a real part of the political present. In the recent Egyptian parliamentary elections, as you all know, a large majority of votes were cast for Islamist parties. A quarter of the vote went to the Salafis, who are committed to a view of Sharia that, among other things, sanctions the stoning of adulterers. So it's the Muslim Brotherhood who now constitute the new reigning liberals of Egyptian politics. This is a source of anxiety not only for the West, but more importantly for secularists in Egypt, of whom there are many, albeit now a clear minority. In certain circles, it's become fashionable to speak of post-secularism, as if secularism has now, in some sense, become outdated, in need of a cultural sequel, a bit like modernism had to be succeeded by postmodernism, rather than something that has to be perennially struggled for and defended. In contrast to that, we need to keep focused on an understanding of secularism cast in directly political terms. A secular regime is one where members of the society are given sufficient breathing space vis-a-vis religion that the political agenda is not subject to compulsory dictation on the part of religious authorities. And citizens can conduct their deliberations about political matters in a distinctively political, that is, citizen-to-citizen idiom. None of us knows where the universe comes from or why it exists. Theists don't know, atheists don't know, agnostics don't know, none of us knows. So for any group of people to come forward and say, not only do they have privileged access to the source of the universe, but they know what rituals it wants performed and what moral codes it wants to see prevail, well, that's both a colossal presumption, morally and intellectually speaking, and also a colossal and potentially very dangerous claim to power and authority. Therefore, it has to be resisted when asserted as a basis of civic privilege. On the other hand, we have a duty, a civic duty, not to express contempt for the sincerely held beliefs of our fellow citizens. We have no choice but to take our fellow citizens as we find them and give them civic space to communicate their political opinions in a manner corresponding to their actual beliefs. I'm aware that there is something of a tension between the two sides of the issue I've tried to articulate, letting people give expression to their actual beliefs and not allowing those beliefs to be leveraged on behalf of indefensible power and authority. Bridging this tension is something we're able to pull off politically through the kinds of compromises that we're familiar with in liberal democracies. We don't bar Mitt Romney from the political arena just because he's a former bishop of the Mormon Church and may have strange ideas of how God revealed himself and what he expects of us, but neither do we tolerate the idea of a Mormon bishop becoming US president as a prelude to instituting a Mormon theocracy. That's the liberal compromise, and very few of us would countenance rejecting either side of this compromise. One view of the relationship between religion and citizenship is that religionists should be disciplined to express themselves in ways that steer clear of philosophically controversial, comprehensive doctrines. That's familiar to everyone as the Rawlsian idea of political liberalism in its simplest form. Rawls himself was forced to develop increasingly convoluted versions of this doctrine on account of the outrage and indignation aroused, understandably, by his initial formulations. Rawls wants a political domestication of religion, but he doesn't want to present it as a domestication of religion, or that suggests any kind of singling out of religion for special treatment. So he hit on the idea of a proscription of all comprehensive doctrines, whether religious or philosophical. From his point of view, all comprehensive doctrines, whether religious or philosophical, are in principle sectarian, and therefore cannot be appealed to in underwriting a properly liberal regime. Hence, despite the paradox, it is illegitimate to appeal to a liberal philosophy of life in founding a liberal polity. If Catholics can't legitimately found the state on a Catholic view of life, because its laws and policies also apply to Protestant co-citizens, and if Protestants can't found the state on a Protestant view of life, because its laws and policies will apply to Catholic co-citizens, then the conclusion might seem equally compelling that one also cannot found the state on a liberal secular philosophy of life. Because again, those who don't subscribe to this philosophy of life will be bound by its laws and policies. So the idea is that would be a kind of liberal theocracy. Political liberalism claims to solve this problem by subjecting all comprehensive doctrines, whether religious or secular, to the test of public reason. While I reject that Rawlsian view, one has to take fellow citizens as one finds them and allow themselves to articulate themselves in a way that actually expresses who they conceive themselves to be. Rawls's ban or partial ban on comprehensive doctrines in the political sphere is misguided, not just because it will be applied in ways that are necessarily non-neutral, hence defeating what Rawls intended in the first place with his idea of public reason, but also because no one can be properly be expected to leave their existential commitments at the doorstep or in the vestibule, as as Chuck puts it, when they enter the sphere of civic life. How can we not find very odd a political philosophy that demands that we drive a wedge between our identity as human beings and our identity as citizens? As I intimated earlier, I would want to say that the illegitimacy of theocratic politics is an entailment of a strong doctrine of citizenship. Now, there's a sense in which Rawls is saying something quite similar to this, but Rawls's ban on comprehensive doctrines within the sphere of public reason makes it harder to affirm philosophically the primacy of citizenship in relation to other aspects of human identity, even if that is, in fact, an underlying Rawlsian theoretical commitment. Rawls objects to this because it commits the great anti-liberal sin of telling people how to be human, which all versions of perfectionism do in one way or another. Now, Chuck's reflections on the nature of modern citizenship are so far-reaching in their scope and so intimidating in their scale that it would be folly for me within the compass of a short presentation to attempt anything other than a very circumscribed response. So I'll restrict my discussion to a couple of Chuck's recent contributions, notably his essay, Why We Need a Radical Redefinition of Secularism, and the just published book with Jocelyn McClure, Secularism and Freedom of Conscience. I'm conscious it's a co-authored book, but everything that I'm interested in that book, there are corresponding articulations of in these other texts. Let's start with the radical redefinition essay. What defines a secular regime on Taylor's account is, first, the right not to be coerced in one's religious beliefs or lack of such beliefs. Secondly, the equality of citizens, irrespective of their beliefs or non-beliefs. And third, the assurance that all voices will be heard and respected. Taylor emphasizes that it's especially important that we exert ourselves to maintain harmony and comity between the supporters of different religions and worldviews. If we need a radical redefinition of secularism, well, what's the reigning conception of secularism that is in need of being radically redefined? It would seem that Taylor has two targets primarily in mind: Ataturk's Turkey and contemporary French republicanism. The latter continues to be animated by the Jacobin impulse, inspired by Rousseau, that there must be a more unitary foundation for peoplehood that can actually be squared with the realities of life in a radically multiculturalized world. Taylor rightly acknowledges the historical fact that in the French case, laïcité came about in a struggle against a powerful church. But for Taylor, this historical background doesn't fully absolve the excesses of Jacobinism. Taylor, I think, makes out his new conception of secularism to be more novel and controversial than it really is. What he offers, in my view, is the standard understanding of a secular regime, accompanied by a more emphatic determination to be welcoming of religious and culturally marginal voices in the civic conversation. If one takes Taylor's two miscreant regimes, Ataturk's Turkey and hyper-republican France, as somehow defining a kind of archetype of the properly secularist regime, then I suppose it might be possible to speak of a need for redefining secularism in light of the challenges of addressing contemporary multicultural realities. But of course, there's no reason for regarding those two regimes as archetypically secularist, relative to, say, the founding of the American Republic. More broadly, I agree with Taylor that there is no need to posit one uniform institutional template for defining the separation of church and state, hence making allowance for the pluralism that's so important to Taylor. Okay, so let's turn to the new book that Taylor has co-authored with Jocelyn. Here's the passage in the Taylor-McClure book that expresses the normative core of Taylor's secularism. In a society where there's no consensus about religious and philosophical outlooks, the state must avoid hierarchizing the conceptions of the good life that form the basis of citizens' adherence to the basic principles of their political association. In the realm of core beliefs and commitments, the state, to be truly everyone's state, must remain neutral. This implies that the state should adopt a position of neutrality not only towards religions, but also towards the different philosophical conceptions that stand as the secular equivalents of religion. Taylor's appeal to the idea of the state being truly everyone's state is highly reminiscent of the Kimlickian principle I quoted at the beginning of my paper, which is why I said that the substance of our views are quite similar. But this principle of the state belonging to all of its citizens, and therefore being prohibited from articulating a state philosophy founded on a sectarian basis, is enveloped by Taylor and McClure in a Rawlsian vocabulary that needs some unpacking. We can call it Taylor's Rawlsian turn. Taylor's reference to philosophical conceptions that stand as the secular equivalents of religion is obviously an allusion to the Rawlsian conception of comprehensive doctrines. This reliance on Rawlsian categories is, I have to say, a bit jarring for someone like me, schooled in the debates of the 1980s or even late 1970s. Let's start with the idea of the neutral state. What the state neutrality idea is intended to convey is not only that theocracies of all descriptions are illegitimate, but also that the liberal state should not use the idea of secularism as a rationale for pursuing a war against religion, as has arguably been the case with the secularist regimes that most trouble Taylor. I have no disagreements here, but the appeal to neutrality is nonetheless problematic, for as Taylor himself has helped to teach us, nothing in life is neutral. It's fairly easy to see what's driving Taylor towards Rawlsianism. Clearly, it's the worry that if we concede that there's a comprehensive doctrine, a view of life, embodied in the liberal state, that will provide a mandate for what Taylor sees as the bad versions of secularism, such as the one we see in France, which leans on Muslim girls to shed their hijabs and requires both them and their parents to profess an allegiance to a French Republican civil religion of robust laïcité. In short, it's Taylor's multiculturalism that's pushing him towards Rawlsianism. But putting to one side this more militant French version of secularism, surely even the good secularism that Taylor prefers embodies non-neutral conceptions of the good. If our state is founded on notions of liberty, equality, and upholding the common dignity of all citizens, then there are definite conceptions of the good instantiated in the liberal state. Taylor, following William Galston, calls this a minimal perfectionism. But a minimal perfectionism is still perfectionism, not neutralism. It may be neutral between Christian liberals, Muslim liberals, and agnostic liberals. But it is certainly not neutral between a liberal vision of life, including civic life, and various non-liberal visions of life, including civic life. And if it's not neutral in the latter sense, it's not neutral, period. Imagine trying to persuade Nietzsche or Marx or Heidegger that the Taylorian Rawlsian conception of liberal citizenship doesn't embody comprehensive doctrines, that it is neutral between rival visions of human life. Since it's obviously my view that referring to the neutral state is misleading, my suggestion would be just to call it the liberal state. Reading the new book, one can't help wondering what happened to the famous liberal communitarian debate of the 1980s. That debate was substantially defined by Rawls's commitment to the priority of the right to the good, and the largely Taylor-inspired insistence that conceptions of the good are never absent and never lose their ultimacy. This, along with much else, is one of the things I learned from Chuck in my youth. Rawlsian neutralism never went away. In important ways, that neutralism became more radical. But Taylor's commitment to conceptions of the good and their centrality to moral life, at least in their political relevance, seems to have weakened, or at least in terms of concession to this Rawlsian rhetoric. Or at least that's what his rapprochement with Rawls in these very recent texts suggests to me. The unmistakable implication of chapters 1 and 2 of Secularism and Freedom of Conscience seems to be that Rawlsian political liberalism gives a better account of Taylor's multicultural commitments than does the doctrine of the ultimate primacy of conceptions of the good. If Taylor is being drawn to a Rawlsian self-understanding, I think that Rawlsianism ought to be resisted, and we should reactivate Taylor's erstwhile commitment to a conception of political philosophy fundamentally oriented to conceptions of the good. So here's an example. If a liberal civic community takes its stand on the principle of full civic equality, it's hard to see how it can permanently resist the claim to equality instantiated in gay marriage. Abiding by Rawlsian strictures, we declare that this change in civic norms is philosophically neutral, related neither to a religious vision of life nor to a non-religious vision of life. It is, so to speak, metaphysically and existentially agnostic. It's simply the playing out of the freestanding political commitments of citizens of a liberal polity. That's the Rawlsian view. But how would, say, an evangelical Christian or a hardcore Catholic like Rick Santorum react to this claim of neutrality? And wouldn't an evangelical Christian be right to react with incredulity? Surely there's some vision of life at play in affirming a robust conception of gays as citizens among citizens. As I've made the point elsewhere, we can't expect a comprehensive doctrine to be trumped by something that's less than a comprehensive doctrine. So my alternative to Rawlsian philosophical neutralism is what I've called citizenship or civicism as a comprehensive doctrine, namely an existential commitment to a life of equal citizenship. And secularism, both as I define it and as Chuck defines it, is part and parcel of this comprehensive doctrine. I'm not convinced that an appeal to a mere overlapping consensus will ever get us to an acknowledgement of the justice of gay marriage. But I am convinced that such an acknowledgement is required by a robust conception of shared citizenship. This suggests to me that we're not likely to do full justice to the relationship between citizenship and secularism within Rawlsian parameters. There's a larger issue here, namely whether it's appropriate for us to look for normative anchors, and also the issue of whether political philosophy is the discipline tasked with locating and articulating these normative anchors. Or is it the case that respect for cultural and religious pluralism is the primary, one could say the overriding, normative concern? Well, I think that Chuck's philosophical inclinations, akin to those of his teacher Isaiah Berlin, lean towards this latter view. I think he gave a beautiful articulation yesterday of what's driving that view, and I fully respect that. But I lean a bit more in the other direction, namely the view that the upholding of secularism as a political ideal ties into firm normative principles, and as such traces a limit to normative pluralism. It also has to be said that the appreciation of cultural diversity doesn't help very much in addressing, for instance, the ongoing conflict between secularists and anti-secularists in post-Mubarak Egypt. One either thinks that the secularists represent the cause of civic sanity and justice, which is the view of all Western liberals, or thinks that this is another case of Western imperialism imposing its own ethnocentric preferences. This is a pretty unyielding either-or, normatively speaking, and is unlikely to bow to considerations of cultural pluralism. Politically speaking, a secular society is one where religious authorities have no special clout, and insofar as they participate in political debate, which is legitimate, it's on the basis of citizen to citizen, rather than minister to those who are ministered to, or pastor to recipients of pastoral care, that is, shepherd to sheep. That's become the norm in Western liberal societies, namely that we relate to each other as citizen to citizen, and we should not allow ourselves to become so fearful of appearing Eurocentric that we hesitate to affirm that norm as normatively justified.